So I do want to take advantage of this space that I've got at the moment. I have had issues with space on my computer, up and down. Sometimes it just sorts itself out. That seems to be the case here. I want to talk about the subject of forgiveness. So we just passed Easter. Yesterday was Easter Sunday. It feels like an appropriate time to talk about it. A little bit of a disclaimer here. I do come from a Christian family, and in recent years I've got a little bit closer to Christianity now. I've never considered myself a particularly religious person, but I've never been an atheist. I do believe in God. I do believe in a greater force. Um, I think faith is a very personal thing, and I think it is a constant journey. That's how I feel about it. So this video wasn't intended to be overly theological. Um, I sometimes study the Bible from a purely historical interest, actually. I'm interested in that part of antiquity, and I'm interested in the historical side of it. I can't say I've studied scripture carefully. I might actually read the entire Gospel of Mark. It's quite short, it's only 22 pages. Um, and, I'm interested in comparing and contrasting the Gospels and the relationship with one another. But on the subject of forgiveness, I just mentioned that because one of the critiques of theology and the Bible, particularly, is it would appear to contradict itself. People will point out, for example, that the Old Testament is full of warfare, vengeance, between the chosen people and the enemies of Israel, etc. And then the New Testament is a lot more heavily favored towards, Christ's message of forgiveness. There is therein a problem with faith. There are inherent contradictions in the Bible, and I've no real answer for that. I've no defense of that. Maybe at a future date, if I get more pious, I might be able to answer to that one. But at the moment, it's a critique I share. There are contradictions, um, but this could probably be said of any major faith. Islam, Muslims will probably talk about the importance of forgiveness, but then likewise, the Quran is full of passages of violent intolerance, surahs that would seem to suggest that. And the retort is always, oh, it's taken out of context. And that might well be true. Islamists certainly don't think so. They will use it for their violent ends. So, yeah, I mentioned the theological thing because it's inevitably part of this. That's not to say that atheists don't have views on forgiveness and the idea of it. But I do think there's a theological basis to what forgiveness is about. Now, I just want to speak from a human perspective what I think of this. I think it's an incredibly personal thing. I do not think that you can impose forgiveness on someone else. That is to say, no one can say to another person, you should forgive them, because they are not going through the experience that person is going through. As an example, if you have a particularly heinous crime that someone has suffered, or more likely they're the relative and their loved one has been murdered, or being a victim of a serious crime, saying to them you should forgive the perpetrator is condescending. It's presumptive. I think it's wrong. So I think forgiveness, the idea of forgiveness, is an incredibly personal thing, and I don't think it should ever be imposed on anyone. It may well be, for example, a Christian finds that their act of forgiveness has helped them, but they still can't say to another person, "Oh, you should forgive." There is a parable of the master who, one of the parables in the New Testament, I think it's one of the parables Jesus told, actually, unless I'm mistaken, about the master who, I think he was in debt, and he begged forgiveness for the man who had loaned him money, and the man did forgive him. But then the servant who had loaned money from him, he then did not pay that in kind. He punished the servant, and Jesus was making the point about, don't judge others if you're not doing it yourself. So this master, this he was punishing his own servant and not showing forgiveness, whilst the man he owed money to did show forgiveness and mercy to him. I think parables are very useful as a narrative to Christ's teachings. But the point about forgiveness, I think a key part of it is the role of the other person. Now, to me, yes, there is an argument that forgiveness helps heal the wronged party, because it puts away that bitterness and it helps them to kind of move on, is probably the wrong word, but it helps them to somewhat adapt to it, somewhat find a degree of peace. Whereas if you're consumed by bitterness, that clearly isn't healthy. On the other hand, I think it's utterly unreasonable to expect someone to forgive or even to forgive if the other party hasn't shown real remorse. Now, we've had many cases in this country of awful crimes, um, and the guilty party has shown no real remorse, or they put on tears for the judge to get a lenient sentence, but they haven't really shown real remorse. And not to go off on a tangent, but um, one of the key things I insist on with justice is that sentencing has to take into consideration, is the offender genuinely remorseful or not. Genuine remorse, part of that should be accepting punishment. It shouldn't be putting on tears in front of the judge, please feel sorry for me. It should be a real deep acknowledgement of the pain that they've caused their victim. And if they don't show that, then I say throw the book at them. Because if an offender doesn't show remorse, how can they be rehabilitated? It goes without saying. So with forgiveness, I think a big part of it has to be the other party showing that they have shown remorse. Or it may be that that opportunity doesn't arise. It may be that the wrong party never sees them again, and they'll never know if that person has real remorse. In my last video, I spoke about the life of George Hall. That's nothing really about forgiveness, but there's another story that's set in that period in the war. Eric Lomax, whose life was also turned into a film, The Railway Man, and the big focus there is on the subject of forgiveness. Now, what's interesting about it is, in fact, I'll show you the book. Just a second. The Railway Man by Eric Lomax. He was a prisoner of war under the Japanese. He worked on the Burma Railway. It's quite a harrowing film. It stars Colin Firth and Nicole Kidman. To 2013, I believe it was made. Um, it's not particularly religious. There's no reference in the book to Christian theology or anything like that. I'm not even sure if Eric Lomax was a Christian. I think he came from quite a conventional Anglican background, but there's no indication that or Presbyterian if it was Scotland, I'm not quite sure. But there's very little reference in this to faith. However, it is true that initially he went to, it would have been in the 1980s, he went to Burma actually to seek revenge on the commandant, the Kampate officer who he held responsible for his torture. And you're very much led to believe he's going there for revenge, basically, almost to kill the man. His commanding officer shows him this newspaper article which shows that the Kampate veteran is running a museum, and they kind of perceive it as he's profiting out of their misery. What they don't realise is this isn't an act of gloating about what he'd done in the war. It's not an act of profiting. It's his way, the Japanese Kempeitai officer's way of trying to make some amends, perhaps with his conscience. Long story short, and here's a spoiler, he goes there and he really is angry. You really do get the impression he's going to kill the guy, but something comes over him and he finds it in his conscience to forgive the man, and they ended up as friends because he realizes this man isn't proud of what he's done. He has genuine remorse, and the reason he's running a museum is actually to reconcile the past, to show yes, Imperial Japan did do these things. They did torture prisoners of war. Um, so it's a powerful story. There's another film, yet another story set in that period, Louis Samperini, I think he was called. Now, in his case, again, an Allied prisoner of war of the Japanese and also an Olympian runner. Angelina Jolie directed a film called Unbroken. In that case, the officer involved with him uh, had no remorse. He was arrogant stubborn neo-nationalist, and he never showed remorse for what he'd done. Nevertheless, Samperini found it in himself to, I think I'm getting that name right. Apologies, my responsibility if it's wrong. Um, he went to Japan, and he ran through the streets of Tokyo where he was cheered by people. So there are remarkable people who find it in themselves to bury that bitterness, even despite horrendous treatment. But I really think it's a personal thing. For instance, I would not say to Ukrainian people today, "Oh, you should forgive the Russians." I think that will be generational. I really do. I think it's much like how many Britons felt after the Blitz. Where there was very strong anti-German sentiments in this country for decades afterwards. And it's all very well for people who have never been through war or been through harrowing experiences directly to kind of say, "Oh, they shouldn't be so bitter" or something. Thinking of wartime, I remember seeing a news item on, not news item, it was part of a documentary on reconciliation in the Balkans. And there was a young Bosnian Muslim man and a Serb girl, and they lived on opposite sides of, I think it was in Mostar in Bosnia. And the Serb girl's attitude was, "Oh, he should just move on." But his, I think his extended family had been massacred, or there was some connection like that, and so that's why I think it's generational. Um, in parts of the world that are very troubled, reconciliation's a major part of that, but so is justice. Now, I come from Northern Ireland. One almost difficult things with the Good Friday Agreement was that ruthless terrorists who had killed many people were set free, some of them having only served a couple of years in prison. These people were mass murderers. I think that must have been incredibly difficult for their victims. We say in Great Britain how often it is, where someone gets a lenient sentence, but Northern Ireland, these were mass murderers being released in some cases after a few years. Yet that was the price of the Good Friday Agreement. And I don't think anyone in Northern Ireland, or very few people, would want to go back to the dark days of the Troubles. Um, but what a price! Was it worth paying? That's for the people of Northern Ireland to decide. I'm Northern Irish, but I haven't grown up there. Um, Forgiveness is a complex thing. I don't think it's reasonable to expect someone to forgive if the other party shows no remorse. I mean, if you have a loved one taken by some criminal, that person, the relative, may never forgive the offender. And why should they? I don't think it may be true that it helps some sort of closure. But again, the case that can only be if the offender has shown genuine deep remorse, and even then, something as profound as murder, where there's no going back. I don't know how. I don't even know how the path of forgiveness begins when there's no going back from that. Um, but it's also something whereby it goes without saying that a lot of conflicts in the world, um, and actually, this is true in old Europe. The old Scandinavian blood feuds come to mind, where a family member was killed, then the brothers of the rival family would be expected to kill his brothers out of vengeance, and then it became a generational cycle of violence, which is just backwards. It goes without saying that that's a never-ending cycle. And some of the world's never-ending wars, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Israel, Palestine, you name it, often there seems to be a lack of any real reconciliation, although there's other factors involved as well. I don't want to oversimplify it. Rwanda, in the case of Rwanda, the reconciliation there, the truth and reconciliation that might be modelled on the South African model, is difficult because often there's been trials of people who've been accused of being genocidaries, but they haven't had a fair trial. Paul Kagame's government's been accused of being a dictatorship, yet which Rwandan would want to go back to the 1990s? Paul Rusesabagina, who wrote the book An Ordinary Man, he's famous for shielding many Tutsis and moderate Hutus during the genocide. He says his fear is when Rwandans are silent, when it appears like they're judging other Rwandans because it could sow the seeds of that all starting up again. I don't think it will, but forgiveness is something that's it sounds like the kind of pacifist, almost appeasing approach to something, but it can be a powerful thing, and it needn't mean. You see, for me, forgiveness is not about depriving. It is not about denying justice. I think you can forgive someone whilst also seeing that they face justice for what they've done. When Ronald Reagan was shot, um, he said he hoped the young man, it was John Hinckley Jr., would find faith or something along those lines. The Pope, that is Pope John Paul II, famously forgave the man who shot him. But if the leader of the Catholic Church can't set an example, then who can? Um, there's a lot of examples like this, but I do think it's a very personal thing, and it's certainly not something that would happen overnight. It's something that can take years, maybe never, maybe never. Um, a final anecdote I'm going to use, the film Born on the 4th of July with Tom Cruise. There's a scene in that where Tom Cruise goes to the family of a comrade who he feels he's let down, and the man's, I think she's a sister or someone like that. She sort of says, "We can never forgive you, but maybe God can." And I guess for people of faith, that might be one thing. As human beings, we can't do that, but it's up to God. I don't know. For me, I have human frailties. I feel anger. I certainly wouldn't be in a rush to forgive someone who hurt me or hurt someone I cared about, even more, someone I cared about. But I do think that with forgiveness, there has to be signs of justice and there has to be signs of the unreal remorse. To me, the absence of that would make it incredibly hard to forgive, even if it meant burying one's own bitterness for one's own sake. Let me know your thoughts. I think there's some theology in this, but not purely. It's something that everyone has to consider at some point in their life. I do think some things are almost impossible to forgive. I mean, how would you say to parents whose child was murdered by a predator, forgive that predator? No, that's ridiculous. That's clearly never going to happen, or highly unlikely. So it is a very personal thing, and in some circumstances, too much of an ask. It is too much of an ask. But for me, if forgiveness was to be, yes, that's an option, it would have to come from seeing justice, seeing that the perpetrator